The sedan burned in the middle of the highway, black smoke rolling upward as the crowd stumbled backward in fear. No one dared step closer because small explosions kept popping from beneath the hood. But Grace Bennett, a single mother just off a long shift, dropped her bag on the pavement and ran straight toward the flames. Through the cracked windshield, she saw a man slumped forward, unconscious, his seatbelt jammed tight against his chest. Grace had only minutes before the fuel tank ignited. What she did not know was that the man trapped inside would change her whole life. If you believe one act of courage can change a life forever, stay with this story until the very end. It was nearly 9 in the evening when Grace steered her aging Honda home after a shift that had run long past its scheduled end. Rain had fallen earlier that day, leaving the surface of Interstate 77 slick and gleaming under passing headlights. Her mind was already on dinner and the pile of laundry waiting for her, the ordinary weight of an ordinary night. Traffic ahead slowed without warning. A black sedan had lost control somewhere near the shoulder, clipped the median, and spun sideways until it came to rest across 2 lanes. Within seconds, thin smoke began curling up from beneath the hood. Cars behind it stopped in a ragged line. A few drivers raised their phones, recording instead of moving. One man started forward, then stepped back the moment a small pop sounded from the engine bay, followed by another. Grace stepped out of her car. She did not sprint immediately. Years of paramedic training had trained her to read a scene before entering it, and in the space of 2 breaths she took in 3 things: which way the wind carried the smoke, where the flames were concentrated, and whether the passenger compartment could still be reached. She called out for someone to dial emergency services, told the gathering crowd to move farther back, and asked a nearby driver to bring the fire extinguisher from his truck bed. Through the windshield, Grace could see a man in his early 40s, unmoving behind the wheel. The fire had not yet reached the cabin. She understood this was the only window she would get. Grace moved to the driver's door first. The frame had buckled in the crash and the door would not give. She circled to the passenger side instead. The glass had cracked, but the lock held firm. A driver hurried over with an emergency window tool. Grace struck the corner of the glass, reached through, and released the lock before climbing partway inside. The man was still breathing. His seatbelt had jammed where the seat frame had bent inward under the impact. Grace pulled at the release, but the mechanism would not budge. Smoke had begun drifting into the cabin around them. Someone outside shouted for her to get clear before the car exploded. Grace did not answer. She found a small emergency seatbelt cutter clipped to another driver's rescue kit and pressed the blade against the strap. It gave way in a single motion. Grace pulled the stranger free of his seat, and together with 2 others who had rushed forward to help, dragged him several yards from the wreck. The moment their feet cleared the vehicle, a sharp blast tore through the engine compartment. They pulled him farther still until the growing fire could no longer reach them. Grace knelt beside the man and checked his airway. For a few seconds his eyes opened. The first thing he saw was not the burning car behind him. It was Grace. He tried to speak, only 2 words made it out: the satchel. Grace turned. In the back seat of the burning sedan sat a brown leather bag. She started to rise. Then she stopped herself. Grace understood the difference between saving a life and dying for an object. Seconds later, the flames swallowed the interior whole, and the satchel disappeared behind a wall of fire. Grace stayed kneeling beside the stranger, her hand steady against his shoulder, watching the wreck burn until the first sirens finally cut through the noise of the crowd. The crowd behind her had grown larger, though no one dared step closer than the makeshift line Grace had set earlier. She kept her attention on the man's breathing, counting each rise of his chest, ignoring the heat still rolling off the wreck a short distance away. Whatever had been inside that satchel no longer mattered to her. Only the man in front of her did. An ambulance arrived within minutes. The man was taken to the hospital with a mild concussion, 2 cracked ribs and light burns along one forearm, none of it life-threatening. Grace refused any attention for herself. When police asked her to describe what happened, she told them simply that anyone with her training would have tried to help, given the chance. Jackson Cole, the investigator assigned to the scene, questioned her carefully. One detail caught his attention. Grace mentioned that just before the fire had truly taken hold, she had caught a strong smell of fuel coming from the rear of the vehicle. Jackson wrote it down. He did not press further that night, but the details stayed with him, filed away for later, the kind of small inconsistency that rarely meant much on its own yet was worth remembering. Grace made it home close to midnight. Her teenage daughter had fallen asleep on the sofa while waiting up for her. Grace pulled a blanket over her shoulders, glanced at the fresh scrape along her own arm, and said nothing. It was the first real appearance her daughter would make in this story, and nearly the last. By morning, footage of Grace running toward the burning car had spread across local pages online, shared and reshared until strangers in neighboring towns recognized her face before she had even finished her first cup of coffee. A headline had already given her a nickname, calling her the woman who ran toward the fire. Grace despised it. She had never wanted attention, and certainly not this kind. Strangers she had never met began leaving messages praising her bravery, while others questioned why she had risked her own safety for someone she did not know. Grace read none of it twice. She had a shift to prepare for and a daughter to get ready for school. At the hospital, the man she had pulled from the wreck was fully conscious. Charlotte Reed, head of legal affairs at his company, sat beside his bed going over paperwork. Through their conversation, it became clear this was no ordinary driver. His name was Mason Hayes, founder and chief executive of Hayes Transit Systems, a company worth several $100 million that built safety and fleet management systems for commercial vehicles. But Mason had no interest in headlines. "Where is the woman who pulled me out?" he asked. Charlotte gave him the name Grace Bennett. Then she asked about the satchel. Mason went quiet. Inside that bag had been copies of documents he intended to hand over to an independent auditing firm the following morning, records tied to a string of safety reports that had been altered somewhere inside his own company. He did not yet know who was responsible. He only knew that someone within his leadership team was keeping something from him. Charlotte suggested the crash might simply have been an accident. Mason wanted to believe that too. But one detail troubled him. The sedan had been serviced at a garage under contract with the company only 2 days earlier, and Mason had told no one outside 3 senior executives that he was carrying those documents home with him that night. He lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Somewhere in the building where he had spent more than a decade building a company from nothing, someone had known exactly where he would be and exactly what he was carrying. The thought unsettled him more than the fire ever had. 2 days later, Grace was in the middle of a shift when she was told she had a visitor. Mason stood in the hallway, still moving carefully, bruises visible along his jaw. Dressed in ordinary clothes rather than a suit, Grace did not recognize him at first. "It seems the last time we met I wasn't exactly at my best," he said. Grace let out a small laugh. It was the first moment that eased the tension between them. Mason thanked her properly this time. He wanted to cover any medical costs, ruined belongings, or losses she had taken on because of what she did. Grace declined. He offered a reward instead, something meaningful given what she had risked. Her expression cooled instantly. "I didn't pull you out because I wanted something from you," she said. "I did it because you needed help. That doesn't make you indebted to me." The words caught him off guard. For years, nearly every relationship in Mason's life had been shaped by money, position, or some form of leverage. Grace showed no interest in any of it. She had not even asked what company he ran, which struck him as almost unbelievable given how rarely that happened anymore. Before he left, Mason asked how she had known what to do in those first critical minutes. Grace explained that she had spent 6 years working as a paramedic before switching careers. After her husband died suddenly of a heart attack, she had moved into a quieter line of work, one that let her keep a stable schedule for her daughter. She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, and Mason did not offer any beyond a brief nod, which she appreciated more than words would have. "Were you scared?" he asked, "running toward that car?" "Yes. Then why did you run toward it anyway?" Grace looked at him steadily. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's just deciding something else matters more." Mason held on to that sentence longer than he expected to. Before he left, he thanked her again, this time without any offer attached to it. After the door closed behind him, Grace noticed something sitting on the counter. Not cash, not a gift. Just a single business card left without a word. Mason had respected her decision after all. It was a small thing, but it shifted something in how Grace saw him. Most people who came through her life with that kind of wealth expected their generosity to be accepted without question. Mason had simply listened and let her answer stand. She slid the card into her pocket and went back to finish her shift, though she found herself thinking about the conversation more than once before the night ended. Later, folding laundry at home, Grace turned the card over in her hand. It listed only a name and a number, nothing else, no title, no company logo pressed into the paper. It struck her as strange that a man who ran something worth hundreds of millions of dollars would hand over something so plain. She set it on the kitchen windowsill rather than throwing it away, telling herself it was simply good manners to keep it, nothing more. Jackson called Grace back in to add to her statement. Preliminary findings showed the fire had originated near the fuel line, and one connector fitting had come loose in a way that raised questions. It was not yet clear whether this pointed to deliberate tampering or simple maintenance failure. Grace repeated exactly what she remembered: the sharp smell of fuel just before the flames spread further than they should have. Jackson asked whether she had noticed anyone near the vehicle before the crash occurred. She had not. Meanwhile, Mason returned to the office. Logan Pierce, the company's chief operating officer, organized a welcome-back meeting and made a point of expressing concern for his well-being. He suggested Mason take a few more weeks away to recover fully. Mason declined. Instead, he asked Charlotte to help him reconstruct the records that had been lost in the satchel. All of it centered on a program called Safe Fleet, a sensor system the company was preparing to launch through several major contracts with transport carriers across the region. Internal engineers had once flagged an issue that could delay a heat warning from triggering at the correct moment. Yet the final report that reached Mason's desk stated the problem had already been resolved. Mason discovered his own digital signature attached to a document he had never actually reviewed. Someone had used his approval without his knowledge. Worse still, the people who had accessed those files all reported directly to Logan. Mason said nothing yet. He wanted proof before he confronted anyone. Around the same time, a reporter approached Grace and offered payment for an exclusive account of what happened that night. Grace turned the offer down without hesitation. The next day, an article appeared implying that Grace had been positioning herself to profit from the wealthy man she had rescued. Grace was stunned. Details about her workplace and her family situation had somehow made it into print. Some strangers began mocking her online, questioning her motives in ways that felt deliberately cruel, picking apart her job, her home, even the fact that she was raising a daughter alone, as though any of it disqualified her from having done something decent. Mason saw the piece. His first instinct was to have his communications team push back publicly and issue a correction. Grace called him before he could act. She told him she had no interest in turning this into a public battle over headlines. But she had one question for him. Who knew my name before the reporters did? The question left Mason silent for a long moment. Only the police, the hospital staff, and a handful of people inside his own company had known Grace's identity the night of the crash. Someone was trying to damage her credibility on purpose. And that meant Grace might have become part of something far larger than either of them had realized. Grace hung up the phone and sat in her kitchen for a long while, staring at nothing in particular. She had not asked to be part of any of this. All she had done was help a stranger on the worst night of his life, and somehow that single decision had pulled her into a world of executives, lawyers, and secrets she wanted no part of. Still, she found she could not simply walk away from the question that now sat heavy in her mind. Jackson showed Grace a series of scene photographs to confirm where she had been standing that night. One image made her pause. Behind Mason's sedan sat a gray SUV. Grace remembered seeing it before the crash, not once but twice. About 10 minutes before the collision, that same SUV had trailed close behind Mason's car, closer than normal traffic would allow. She had not caught the full license plate. But she remembered one detail clearly: a small triangular crack in the left tail light. Traffic cameras along that stretch of highway were pulled and reviewed. Footage showed the SUV had not struck Mason's car directly. It had, however, stayed unusually close before he lost control, then left the highway almost immediately after the crash occurred. Jackson began treating it as a genuine line of investigation rather than a passing detail. He asked Grace to sit with a sketch artist to describe the vehicle more precisely, and though she insisted she was no expert on cars, the details she offered matched the footage closely enough that Jackson grew more confident the SUV was not a coincidence. Back at the company, Charlotte discovered that a matching SUV was registered to a security contractor Hayes Transit had hired for facility work. Manager overseeing our contract reported directly to the office of the chief operating officer. Mason wanted to go to the police immediately, his patience for caution wearing thin after weeks of uncertainty. Charlotte urged caution. What they had so far was a connection, not proof that Logan had directed anyone to do anything. Mason agreed, reluctantly. He did not want this to become a story about a CEO accusing his own second-in-command based on suspicion alone. Meanwhile, Grace was called into a meeting with hospital administration because reporters had begun gathering outside the building where she worked. No one let her go, but Grace felt her private life being pulled into public view in a way she had never asked for. Mason heard about it and came to apologize in person. Grace's frustration surfaced immediately. "You didn't start that fire," she told him. "No," Mason said. But my world keeps spilling into yours. Something shifted in how Grace saw him in that moment. He was not simply a powerful man giving orders from behind a desk. He genuinely felt responsible for what was happening to her, and he was willing to say so plainly rather than hide behind an assistant or a prepared statement. It was the first quiet step towards something neither of them named yet. There was no flirtation, no dramatic declaration following a rescue. Only the slow, careful beginning of trust, built from small honest moments rather than grand gestures, the kind that neither of them fully noticed forming until it already had. Driving home that night, Grace kept thinking about the way Mason had looked at her, not with pity or obligation but with something closer to respect. It was not a feeling she had let herself sit with in a long time, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it. Police traced the SUV to its driver, a contractor named Connor Blake employed by the security firm Hayes Transit used for facility work. Connor denied any connection to the crash, but phone location data placed him at the garage where Mason's car had been serviced in the days leading up to the accident. Jackson secured a warrant to search the property. Inside, investigators found that exactly 47 minutes of security footage had gone missing from the night the vehicle was serviced. A technician eventually admitted that someone had instructed him to leave Mason's car in the service bay after hours. The request had come through an internal code used only within Hayes Transit. There was a twist buried inside all of it. The original goal had never been to kill Mason. Logan had hired Connor to retrieve the satchel, nothing more. Connor was told to create a minor malfunction, enough to force Mason to pull over, then take the bag during the confusion that followed. But whoever tampered with the fuel line had done the job carelessly. What was meant to be a forced stop on the shoulder of the highway became a near-fatal accident instead. That detail made the whole situation feel less like some flawless plot and more like a mistake that had spiraled far beyond what anyone intended, the kind of error that could have quietly disappeared if the fire had simply run its course as planned. Connor grew increasingly anxious in the days after the fire. He understood that if things unraveled, Logan would distance himself completely and let him take the blame alone. Connor began quietly reaching out to negotiate with investigators. Logan, sensing the inquiry closing in around him, shifted toward a more calculated approach. He called an emergency meeting of the board of directors and suggested that Mason was no longer fit to lead the company following his injury. He presented documents suggesting Mason himself had approved the Safe Fleet rollout. If the truth about the safety failures ever surfaced, Mason would be the one held responsible. Mason began to understand the full shape of what Logan had built. This was not only about hiding one technical flaw. For years, Logan had quietly cut corners in testing to boost profit margins and inflate his own record, positioning himself to eventually take over as chief executive. If Mason exposed what he knew, the company could lose major contracts overnight, and Logan himself could face criminal charges for fraud. The satchel had been the one thing capable of unraveling all of it, but Logan had made one critical assumption. He believed the only original copy of those records had burned along with the sedan. Mason later told Charlotte that before the crash, he had copied a portion of the files onto an offline storage drive. That drive was still sitting untouched inside the safe at his home. Charlotte let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. For days she had assumed the case against Logan would rest entirely on circumstantial links, a garage technician's testimony, a contractor's phone records, fragments that a good lawyer could pick apart in a courtroom. A drive full of the original engineering reports changed everything. It would not just support their case, it would make Logan's version of events impossible to defend. Mason arranged to retrieve it quietly that same evening, telling no one outside Charlotte and Jackson where he was going or why. He drove home alone that night, the city lights blurring past the window as he replayed the past several weeks in his mind. Somewhere in that stretch of time, a company he had built from almost nothing had quietly turned into a place where a man he trusted had been willing to gamble with someone else's life to protect his own position. Mason opened the safe, lifted the drive out with both hands, and sat with it for a long moment before finally closing the door behind him. Hayes Transit prepared to hold a public briefing to announce its internal review of the Safe Fleet program. The communications team suggested that Grace stand beside Mason during the announcement, believing the image of the woman who had saved her CEO would help repair the company's public image. Before Mason could even respond, Grace declined. She told them plainly that she was not a prop for their messaging. Mason stood by her decision in front of the entire team without hesitation. It was a defining moment in their relationship. Grace realized Mason had no interest in owning her story or using it for his own benefit. Mason, in turn, recognized that Grace would never let power or wealth bend her principles, not even slightly. That evening, they met at a small coffee shop, the first time they had spent time together for reasons that had nothing to do with the accident or the ongoing investigation. Grace asked why he had never married. Mason answered simply that he had spent too many years believing his work could wait less than the people around him could. He did not turn the moment into a tale of tragic solitude. He said it plainly and let it sit there without asking for sympathy. Grace spoke briefly about her own life as a single mother, the tight schedule, the rent, the exhaustion, and the quiet weight of always having to solve everything herself, a routine so constant she rarely stopped to think about how heavy it had become. Her daughter was not part of the conversation, and no scene placed the child anywhere near either of them. Mason made no attempt to step into some fatherly role in her life, and Grace appreciated that more than she let on. She had watched other men try to insert themselves too quickly into her family before, and the restraint felt like its own kind of respect. The romance between them stayed gentle, unhurried, the kind that grew from ordinary conversation rather than dramatic gestures. When it came time to leave, Mason offered to drive her home, but Grace said her own car was parked nearby. He smiled. "Do you ever let anyone help you?" "Sometimes," Grace answered, "when I actually need it." "Then I'll wait," Mason said. The line carried two meanings, though neither of them turned it into an early declaration of anything more. Grace drove home that night with the radio off, replaying pieces of the conversation in her mind. She had grown used to being the one who handled things alone, and something about sitting across from someone who did not expect that from her felt unfamiliar in a way she could not quite name. It was not love yet. It was simply the quiet start of something neither of them was ready to rush. At home, Grace sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea long after the house had gone quiet, replaying the evening in her mind. She caught herself smiling at odd moments, small enough that no one would have noticed, but they're all the same. Logan moved first. He called an emergency session of the board and presented evidence showing Mason's digital signature attached to the safe fleet approvals. He suggested that Mason step aside temporarily while the matter was investigated. Several board members appeared ready to agree, murmuring among themselves about liability and public perception, about how the company could weather another wave of bad press if the man at its center were seen as unstable after his injury. Mason did not respond with emotion. He simply placed a small storage drive on the table in front of him. Charlotte walked the room through system logs showing that Mason's account had been accessed using a backup administrative key, one that belonged to the office of the chief operating officer. Logan argued that any member of his staff could have used it. Mason then presented the original engineering reports. They showed that Logan had received warnings about the safe fleet defect months earlier, yet had ordered the rollout to continue regardless. Logan remained composed. Until Jackson entered the room, accompanied by legal counsel and a police officer, following the appropriate procedures rather than making a dramatic, unannounced arrest. Jackson informed the board that Connor had agreed to cooperate, providing text messages, payment records, and instructions tied directly to the tampering of Mason's vehicle. The evidence was thorough enough that no one in the room raised a single objection. Logan understood, in that moment, that everything was over. He glanced toward the door as if calculating an exit that no longer existed, then settled back into his chair with the practiced calm of a man who had spent years controlling rooms far more difficult than this one. What mattered most was not the confrontation itself, but what came after. Mason did not celebrate. He looked at the man he had worked alongside for more than 10 years and asked a single question. Was any contract worth putting someone else's life at risk? Logan answered that Mason had never understood the pressure of keeping the company afloat. Mason replied evenly, "No company deserves to survive if survival means treating people as something disposable." Logan was suspended immediately and later formally charged based on the results of the ongoing investigation. There was no physical struggle, no dramatic chase through hallways. The turning point rested entirely on evidence and the quiet collapse of trust that had once held their partnership together. For a long moment after Logan was escorted out, the boardroom sat in uneasy silence. Board members who had known Logan for years struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with what the evidence now showed. Mason simply gathered his papers, thanked Charlotte and Jackson for their work, and stepped out into the hallway alone, carrying the weight of a decade-long partnership that had ended in exactly the way he never wanted it to. Outside, the city looked the same as it had that morning, unaware that inside those glass walls an entire chapter of the company's history had just quietly closed. Weeks later, the company publicly disclosed the safe fleet defect and voluntarily paused the rollout across all its contracts. Mason accepted the financial hit that followed without hesitation. He formed an independent safety review team so that engineers could report risks directly, without their concerns passing through business leadership first. The company's reputation took an early dip, but the way Mason handled the crisis slowly began rebuilding public trust rather than damaging it further, a shift that surprised even his own communications team, who had braced for far worse fallout. The city offered Grace a formal commendation for her actions that night. This time, she accepted. Not because of Mason. She had thought carefully about the decision before accepting, weighing her usual discomfort with public attention against the chance to actually change something. In the end, the chance to reach more people won out. She wanted the moment to highlight something larger, that ordinary people learning basic rescue and first aid skills could genuinely save lives when it mattered most. At the ceremony, Mason stood near the back of the room instead of beside her in front of the cameras. Grace noticed. Afterward, she found him and asked what he thought he was doing hiding back there. "This is your day," Mason said. Grace smiled. "You finally learned." "I had a fairly demanding teacher," he replied. It was a moment where the chemistry between them was unmistakable, yet still handled with restraint rather than spectacle. Later, Mason told Grace he wanted to fund a free emergency response training program for drivers across the city. He asked whether she would be willing to help design the program as a paid advisor. Grace agreed, but only after confirming this was genuine work and not simply another way for Mason to repay her for what she had done. In this way, Mason never tried to rescue Grace with money. Grace earned her place through her own expertise, on her own terms, and that distinction mattered more to her than anything he could have offered otherwise. She had spent years being underestimated in rooms full of people who assumed a nurse with a modest paycheck had little of value to contribute. Working alongside Mason's team, she found her opinions carried weight precisely because she had earned them, not because anyone owed her a favor. The program launched within a month, drawing far more interest from local drivers than either of them had expected, and Grace found herself busier than she had been in years, though not in a way that felt like a burden. She spent her weekends walking new volunteers through the same steps she had followed on the highway that night: how to assess a scene before rushing in, how to recognize the narrow window when help could still make a difference. Watching strangers absorb the same instincts that had once saved a man's life gave her a quiet sense of purpose she had not expected to find at this stage of her career. 6 months passed. The roadside rescue program, run jointly by Hayes Transit and the city, had trained thousands of drivers on how to respond correctly when they encountered an accident. What began as a modest pilot in one district had expanded to cover the entire metro area, with instructors now including several of the very drivers who had once needed the training themselves. Grace kept her main job but became a part-time advisor to the program, splitting her hours between the two without either one suffering for it. Her daughter appeared once more in the story, briefly, the second and final time. One evening, as Mason arrived to take Grace to dinner, her daughter teased her mother for having changed outfits 3 separate times before he showed up. Grace swatted her daughter's arm lightly, laughing despite herself. The moment stayed small, a passing detail of ordinary life rather than a scene built to pull the child deeper into the romance developing around her. Mason and Grace had not moved in together. There was no rushed engagement, no dramatic proposal following everything they had been through, and neither of them felt any urgency to explain that choice to anyone who asked. They were simply dating, taking their time the way two adults who had both been burned by rushing things before now chose to move. Mason had learned, slowly, that Grace valued honesty over grand gestures, and he found himself adjusting to a relationship that asked nothing of his wealth and everything of his attention. Grace, in turn, discovered that the version of Mason she had come to know outside the boardroom was steadier and far more patient than the headlines about his company ever suggested. One evening they drove past the stretch of highway where the accident had happened all those months earlier. Mason glanced over at her. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd run the other way that night?" Grace considered it for a moment. "You'd have been in serious trouble." Mason laughed. "That's it?" Grace turned toward him. "And I wouldn't have to put up with a CEO who asks so many questions." Mason laughed harder, the sound filling the quiet car. After a few seconds, his tone shifted, softer now. "I spent my whole career building systems meant to keep people safe. But that night, the thing that actually saved me was just one person who refused to walk away." "Don't make me out to be some hero," Grace said. "I don't need to," Mason answered. He looked at her. "I just know your Grace." He reached his hand across the space between them. Grace took it without hesitation. There was no proposal, no grand declaration of love spoken into the night, just two people who had first met each other in the worst moment of one of their lives, now choosing freely and quietly to walk into each other's lives on ordinary terms. Behind them, the stretch of highway where the car had once burned looked like nothing more than an unremarkable road. And Grace understood something she had not fully grasped that night months earlier, that sometimes a person runs toward danger to save a stranger's life, never knowing that the same choice is also quietly opening a new path for their own. Grace never set out to be anyone's idea of a hero. She was a tired single mother driving home from a long shift who simply refused to look away when someone else needed help. That single choice pulled back the curtain on a company built on quiet compromises, exposed a man willing to trade safety for profit, and slowly opened a door to a life she never expected. What stayed with her afterward was not the fire, the headlines, or even the man she pulled from the wreck. It was the simple truth that courage rarely announces itself in advance. It shows up in ordinary people who decide in one unremarkable moment that walking away is simply not an option. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is the thing nobody else is willing to try first.